Hello, my name is Lorraine Taylor, and welcome to all of you for our session. We're talking about getting into horticulture and specifically choosing land for commercial field crops in Alberta. And with us this evening is Robert Spencer. We are a group of counties northwest, south of Edmonton, and we're partnering on this session and some others, talking about different possibilities for commercial horticultural crops. And those counties include Barrhead, Lac St. Anne County, Leduc, Parkland, Sturgeon, Woodlands, Yellowhead, and the MD of Greenview. And our intention is to develop a sort of a roadmap over the next couple of years, offering seminars, workshops, and field tours covering all steps from planning to production. And so I would like to introduce our presenter, Rob Spencer of Spencer Horticultural Solutions. And I feel like we're very fortunate to have Rob in the province to share his industry expertise with us. Rob is well known by vegetable and fruit growers across Alberta. And for over 17 years, he was the provincial horticulture specialist with Alberta Agriculture, and he hosted many workshops and field tours. He wrote horticulture production manuals and covered all aspects of production and marketing in his monthly Hort Snacks newsletter, still a favorite of mine. In March 2020, Rob started Spencer Horticultural Solutions, delivering customized horticultural consulting services to a range of clients. And Rob has a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture with a major in horticulture and a Master of Science, Plant Sciences from the University of Saskatchewan. And Rob also is quite involved in horticulture on a community side as well. And so he currently is an instructor at Olds College, and he's teaching the next generation for the horticulture industry and greenhouse production, field crop production, including vegetables, fruits, nursery, and specialty crops. And with that, I would like to welcome you, Rob.
Thanks, Lorraine. It's good to be here. Hope everybody can hear me. Okay, ready to roll? Okay. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about choosing land for horticultural field crops. So the idea here is to give you a sense of some of the considerations and tools that are available for assessing site suitability. So if you've got land, or you want to buy land, or you're wanting to shift land from one use to another, I want to take you through some different thought processes, as well as some of the tools that I will often use to take you from 10,000 feet down to -1 foot to gather information on land. There'll probably be some gaps in terms of what you're looking for information, but that's the idea here, is to get you started. So tonight I'm going to give you some overall and general site requirements. If you're looking to set up a commercial field or a field production operation, what are some of the things you need to be looking at in terms of a site? Maybe you have some of those, maybe you don't. What are some of the things you might need to be looking at investing in terms of adding? And then what are some of the physical characteristics of the site that you want to be looking at, and what are some of the, how do you gather the data? So we'll look at the soil from a 10,000 foot level, or might even be 100,000 foot level, all the way through to about 12 inches below ground and down to the soil test level. Then we'll look at sort of climatic information and data that helps support, if you're thinking about a specific type of crop, will it work in your area based on the land you have? Is that site suitable for the things that you're thinking about? And then we'll talk a little bit about water, and then if there's any other data that you might want to consider looking into to help support your sort of your journey forward, right? Okay, and I mean, there'll be connections if you wanted to reference some of the past presentations. I talked a little bit about some of the considerations from the whole sort of the operational and industry's perspective. This one deals with sort of the nitty-gritty and the dirt. So, okay, so that's my goal anyways. Whether we get there or not, we'll find out at the end. Okay, so some of the overall requirements that a horticultural operation needs, whether it be fruit, whether it be vegetable, whatever. If you're looking at a direct market operation, that may sometimes add some specific requirements. But as a general rule, you're likely going to need shelter from the winds. So shelter belts of some sort, whether they be man-made, natural, whatever. Shelter is important. You're going to need buildings, and what type of building will depend on the operation. It could be as simple as, you know, a sales shed, or it could be, you know, equipment storage. It could be some other type of building that's required, and there may be multiple buildings that are required. You're likely going to need utilities depending on what you're going to be doing on that site. If you're planning on running any type of things that need power, you may need power and gas and other types of utilities. So that's a consideration. Are you going to need parking, both for employees and staff, as well as for if you're bringing clients, customers onto your site to pick or to do whatever? You know, are you gonna have a place to put them? And that requires a certain amount of space. You have to give consideration to the market. If you're choosing a site and you said, okay, I want to grow, and I want to cut flowers and I want people to come and pick them. Well, and if you're 250 kilometers away from a major center, and most of your area there isn't a population to support a market, that might maybe not be the right choice. Maybe you need to look at a different market option. Maybe the site's perfect, but maybe your idea for using it needs to be shifted. But you need to consider, ideally, being close to a customer base, whatever the size might be. Do you have people to work on the farm? Do you have labor? How is that going to look? Have you considered labor? Maybe that's not a factor, but maybe it's something that you need to at least have ruled out or considered anyways. It's good to have easy access all-weather roads. And there's two pieces to that. All-weather means you can access them at any time of year, whether it's muddy or whether it's snowing, raining, whatever. Easy access means that the city people can get to your farm if you're bringing them there. So it doesn't have too many turns. It's not, you know, you can't count on people to be able to find your place. It's got to be easy, and easy to you might not be the same as to them. But consider that, you know, some sites just are better because they're just a turn or two off the highway, and it's pretty easy to mark. If everybody's turning right all the time, that's pretty simple. But if people have to turn left and right and left and right and wiggle their way down to you, it might be a little more complicated. The last overall consideration or requirement that I always suggest is looking at, you need a water source. You need legal access to the water, and you need it to be a quality water source. And it shouldn't be a well. Well water is just generally for horticultural operations is just not suitable. It might be suitable for some uses, but from an irrigation perspective, which most horticultural crops will require, it's not likely going to be suitable as a medium to long-term water source. Maybe in a pinch you might be able to use it, but keep that in mind. Just because you got a good flowing well doesn't mean you can use it for irrigation. Looking at the layout of an operation, or looking at the site of what needs to be done, you know, depending on the type of operation you're setting up, you're going to have to design the site so that it's most efficient. Placing the buildings and the growing areas and roadways effectively to allow movements of plants and people and being efficient will sort of enhance the site. If you have an existing infrastructure, you need to consider how does that work with what you're planning. So if you don't have a site and you're looking at one, look at, okay, the fields is one thing, and that's really my main focus usually is looking at the fields. But if there are infrastructure on there, how does that play along with the things that are happening or going to be happening on that site? So things to consider, again, with the existing infrastructure: what's the soil like? Do you have windbreaks or shelter belts? Are there public areas, or do you need public areas? What's the circulation like for movement of vehicles and equipment or other things, or vehicles in terms of parking and moving customers around? Do you have shipping and receiving areas, storage facilities? It just depends on what type of movement you're going to be having, but consider if that's part of your operational requirement, you know, how is that going to work? Do you need a storage? Do you need administration facilities, employee facilities, washrooms, lunchrooms, things like that? So keep that in mind. Or are there facilities in place or infrastructure in place that you can adapt to what you need to do? Okay, so let's look at some of the general site requirements and the physical characteristics. So now we're going to get into, so does this going to work to grow something? Okay, so as I mentioned, protection from wind. This, be the main one. A natural or planted shelter belt would be ideal. And in some cases, you got to plant it. You have to establish it, and you've got to figure out a way to protect your crops before they establish. If you've already got one, great. You have to assess what the quality is like and if that's going to work for you. We generally want good soil, and good soil is variable depending on what type of crop we're growing. Generally, we want something that drains well, is of medium, moderate texture. I mean, that again can vary, but again, the type of crop that we're going to grow might be okay with a lighter soil or a heavier soil, depending on where on the spectrum we're going to be. But we want to know what the soil is like. We want lots of sun because all crops are going to need lots of light. And we want a moderate slope so that we get some air drainage and we also get water drainage. We don't want low areas that collect water like a swimming pool, right? So we want to look for areas that are going to be suitable in that way. When we're looking at slope, we generally want something between 1% and 5% slope, again, for that air and water drainage. So we don't want things to be blocked. We want to make sure that there aren't frost pockets. When the cold air moves and collects, it isn't going to kill our crops off. We want to have some shelter from the prevailing winds, as I mentioned, and then again, avoid those low spots that'll collect standing water or potentially collect cold air and have frost pockets. So, I mean, it's hard to predict, but again, just having a sense of what that land looks like, what the topography is like, is going to be important. Keeping in mind that we're not going to find something that's laser leveled and flat, or not likely. And if it is laser leveled and flat, like Manitoba, you know, are there going to be any sort of inherent issues? Just because a site isn't perfect, doesn't mean it's not useful. You just have to know what those potential risk areas are and if they can be mitigated or not. Okay. So shelter belts are necessary because they help collect snow. They cut down on soil water loss and desiccation losses from, as the wind blows, it sucks the moisture out. And so we want to kind of cut that down. If you don't have a shelter belt, you're going to want to establish them. If you have established shelter belts, bonus, beauty, you got something. And if you don't, there are ways around it in the short term for sure. Snow fence, planting annual corn rows, sunflower rows, even just using wind fence or board fences, depending on what crop you're growing, it can work. Okay, and there's calculations. I mean, for about every meter of height of a block, you get about 10 meters of distance of protection and effect on snow and wind speed and things. And that's downwind. Upwind, you get about 3 to 5 meters. So other things to look for and to consider when you're planning your site and thinking about this, and this again is, you got to have an idea in your head of what this operation is going to look like. So when you go looking for the land or you're trying to fit it into the land you have, is it going to work? So something else you're going to consider is headlands. I mean, you can take a look at a piece of land and say, okay, I can put this much plants, I can do this many things, but you have to consider there needs to be some waste areas to allow you for moving around on it efficiently without wrecking things or not creating this huge bottleneck of constrictions on the site. So grass headlands are good for ease of access, and it also makes those need to be clean and tidy, and they allow things just to allow for easier movement. We also want to make sure that if we're turning equipment, we need lots of space for that. Here's a picture. This is an old picture, and I've borrowed it from a friend down by Strathmore. But this was an early stage of establishment of a strawberry field, and you know, strawberries were growing well and coming along, and they had lots of places to turn around. They had the irrigation lines, and then they had this developing shelter belt that they put in here, and a snow fence that they used also to kind of break things up a little bit, and that worked okay. Fast forward probably 20 years, and here we are again. This is actually at the other end of the field. They had shelter belts at a different end. Like the picture of the other one would have had those shelter belts over here. Actually, they're actually right here. But they had built other shelter belts. They had shelter belts in place, and they had the protections in place, and so that site was well protected sufficiently, anyways, to cut down on desiccation and to collect snow and to just, I mean, if Southern Alberta equals wind, and so this site was suitably protected. So just to, again, refresh your memory. So this shelter belt right here is this shelter belt right here now. So it's grown quite a bit and provides protection. And at the top of my screen would be south. So this is west over here. Okay, so you get the idea of where we're trying to get. So if we're looking at the physical characteristics and general consideration, we need to look at what kind of site do we need and how does that fit, excuse me, with the size and type of operation that we want to do? What's the topography of that site look like? What's the soil like? What are we going to be doing for cultural practices? Are we going to be, conventional? Are we non-conventional? Are we using lots of tillage? Are we using big equipment, small equipment? What type of equipment are we using? What kind of labor are we doing? Is this going to be hand labor, or is there going to be, again, type of equipment that's going to be needed to be moved around? How mechanical or mechanized are we going to be in this operation? All of those have to be considered when building the sort of that mental image of what that operation looks like. And then is that mental operation that we've pictured going to fit in the land that we have that we want to do? The other consideration when you're building that operation is some of the economic realities. I mean, it's fine to build this, sort of mystical, magical looking thing, but there are times when sometimes the economies of it mean that we have to start small and move bigger. And sometimes, the cost of the land or something like that might, in fact, impact how big we can go, at least in the short term. Start small, move big. Okay, so now we're going to look at those specific physical factors. So I mentioned three of them. One is soil, second is climate, and the third is water. Okay. So what I'm going to, as I mentioned before, the soil, the field considerations you need to have when we're looking at a soil, we need to know, we want a soil that is typically in the moderate, a sandy loam, a loamy type soil. We want something that's got enough water holding and nutrient holding capacity that'll support growth of most plants, but we don't want it to be holding water and never letting it go. So we want to avoid this, probably avoid the heavy clays, things like that. Super sandy soils or very sandy soils tend to be, they dry out so fast that it could become problematic. Again, not a deal breaker, but it's, if we're shooting for the ideal, we want a sandy loam soil. We want something that's well drained. We want something that's relatively neutral or slightly acidic. We want something with a good amount of organic matter, which represents, again, water, nutrient holding capacity, a store of nutrients, as well as compounds that help make the soil that we have better. And then the last thing we want to know is we want to know what's been grown on there before and what's been used on that, around and on it, in case that might affect what we're going to do in our operation. When we're gathering soil information, we need to gather that on a number of layers. And I like to start at a really large, wide scale. Generally, what's the topography like? What's the slope like? And how suitable is it at a really wide level? Is it, because you can get a sense of nope or yup, and that's really as far as you're going to go. And then as you wiggle your way down to closer focus, you're going to get more information and decide, both is it suitable, and then what do I need to do to manage my crops in that space? So let's start at the wide and large scale. So I'm going to take you on a guided tour of the Alberta Soil Information Viewer. Normally I would take you through it and we'd go live and click through, but I've just done a bunch of screen captures, just taking you through it visually. It's an interesting tool. It provides lots of really high level metadata, like background data. This is based on parent material, and keep in mind that it's covering big swaths of land, big areas. And so it speaks to the land in general terms, not going to be like, okay, I've got 20 acres over here. What's it like? What you're going to get a sense of is, I've got 20 acres over here. It's part of this 754 acre profile. What am I going to get from a general sense? What can I expect from that? Is it good or bad, or that kind of thing? This type of information does exist in other regions. I'm not as familiar with the other regions, but they do exist. And so that kind of information could be gathered. One of the nice things that they did back in the olden times was that they did a lot of soil testing and they gathered a lot of data. And so just a question of accessing that data and finding it and using it. So here, I'll take you through this tour just to show you the things, but this is the link of where you'd find it. So you can find it. We'll include that in the resources that come with the recording. Okay, so this is the Alberta Soil Information Viewer. When you get there, it says, hello, welcome. So you just close that and continue on. And the first thing you'll see is a map of Alberta. You can scroll in using the scroll wheel on your mouse, or you can use the plus or minus buttons to scroll in on the map of Alberta. You can kind of see, and maybe you can, it's a little bit grainy. As you get closer, you're going to see the sections, townships, all the pieces are going to start to pop out. On this side, we have different functions and things that we're going to choose from. But first we'll scroll in here. And so just for the sake of fun, we're going to just focus up here in the Busby area, northwest of Edmonton. So we've scrolled in, and now we can take a look at, and we can choose different base maps. So here you click on the base map area, and it's going to change it to a different type. So we have choices here. And as I click here, I chose the imagery with labels. So this is essentially your kind of your Google Earth map type thing. This is going to give you sort of the picture of the vegetation and all of the features that are there. I mean, you could choose other ones like terrain, topography, those types of things if that's what you're interested in. But for the sake of this, I find looking at from this, it helps me visualize, because you get a sense of what's growing. Like, is it a forest or whatever, like what am I expecting? Is this clearly it's cultivated pieces? You can see lakes and ponds and sloughs and things that were there at the time of the pictures being taken. But this is the first piece that I usually choose, is that base map. Then if you close this out with the X, you've got it selected now. Then you can start zooming in a little closer, and you can choose, you'll start to see these outlines, and these are called polygons. Soil polygons are information that has been gathered that is about a certain type of an area of land. And you can see they're all weird shaped and they vary in size. But each one contains a bunch of physical data that relates to the parent material that is useful in gathering some information. You can also see the legal land locations, information on the section numbers and that kind of thing. So we have these polygons, and now I want to take you through what's inside the polygon. So within the polygon, as you click it, it'll kind of gray out, and that's that polygon, right? And the polygon has a number, and there's a whole bunch of data associated with it. So you click to highlight the polygon to access the different information, and then within that you can gather information on the land information, the LSRS information, the land suitability rating system information, polygon labeling, and other things. And I'll just take you through what those look like a little bit. So if we click on general information, we can get, the LSRS rating from that area, which relates to spring grains. You can get a little sense of what the landform's like, and what that means in terms of, there's terms like hummocky and stuff like that. It gives you a sense of these, the types of soils that are in there, and they use these fancy words like orthot, gray, luvasol, and other things, and you don't have to be a soil scientist to understand them. But ultimately, it gives you a sense of, polygon includes some poorly drained soils and soils that are coarser textured, and then dominant and codominant are kind of the main soils within that. And if we click a little further, we can gain a little bit of information on, we can get some of this stuff on the landform profile, which with the different slope positions and what they're like. And most of that information isn't all that super useful, but it does give you a sense of, is the land going to be, is it going to be flat? Is it going to be back and forth? If you click on an image back here, actually, you can click on an image and get a sense of what that land looks like in a general sense. What does hummocky mean? Okay. if we click on the LSRS rating, the land suitability rating system, it comes up and gives you a rating. It also tells you how big the shape is. So this is about 1,500 hectares. So the area of the polygon, and then this is the LSRS. And I'll show you what the LSRS means here. So this is the interpretation. So basically it gives you a sense of climatic, soil, and landscape restrictions and limitations. And the class relates to no worries, 1, all the way through to 7, unsuitable. And then if you look at the code, and so the one that we were looking at here, the 2HT, is a slight risk of, and H is temperature, so inadequate heat units, and T is slope. So there are some steep slopes that could give you some water erosion or limit production. You know, is that going to be the case everywhere? No, not necessarily, but it's just a risk thing. The second half, 7W, which is unsuitable, and W relates to drainage. So they may have excess water, which would limit production. So these are just risk things. You might say, okay, well, I got to watch for that. Keeping in mind that this is 1,500 hectares. That's a huge area. Your little 20-acre piece might have none of that. But it's just important to note that you get a bit of information. Again, we're looking at 10,000 foot level. We're not right at the ground level yet. We can go back to those other things we're choosing from, choosing attributes. You want to stay visible on the polygon. So we could choose the polygon ID so we know which one it is. You could put the area, or you could outline the perimeter. You could click this on and off. I prefer to leave the perimeter on so I can see what I'm looking at. You know, you can label those types of things. As you click into the specific information on the polygon, so this is polygon number 18932, you could look at it, and the idea here is it tells you what percentage of that polygon is that sort of that class or that type, right? So 60% of the land is made up of sort of the mid-slope type landform, and you know, some of the information like that. You can also click down and see a little bit more on the soil. So it gives you just a little bit better sense of what types of things to expect. We keep moving on. You can look at soil types, texture, parent material, that kind of thing. So we're looking at, if you grab somebody that knows like what these luvisols are or what are those kind of things, they can potentially provide some more interpretation. But the key thing is the parent material texture is generally fine texture, moderately fine textured, some sand clay loams, and silty clay loams, well drained. So that's good, and that's for the 60% of the soils in this polygon are going to have that type of information, or that type of things you can expect. That's a pretty broad spectrum still, but it still gives you an idea. If they say, you know, it's a 80%, you know, clays and things, maybe you want to stay out of that. And here we're looking at, you know, the different horizons, the different depths, and texture class is loam, and it gives you a sense of what these things are going to be. As you dig into your soil test, you're going to get that information. But this again gives you a good sense of, you know, what are the soils like in that whole area. And the key I want to remind you is that this applies to large swaths of land. We're still looking at 1,500 hectares or 3,500 acres. So we're looking at big areas still. Okay. Once you've looked at the polygon, you can still see the polygon outlined here, but you can zoom in on quarters or sections and quarters and get a sense of, okay, I'm looking at this land here. What am I looking at? So I can look here and I say, okay, well, there's some brushed area here. This looks like some rough area here, a little slough or pond here, some rough area. And this looks like it's been cultivated in some way for some time, right? As opposed to, say, over here, you know, not a lot of open area, it's mostly brush, and that's going to affect what the soils are like and what I can do with that area. Okay. But the aerial view gives you a good sense of what the features look like. And I like to look at that as I zoom down. So if I'm looking at it for a client and they say, well, okay, I want to do something on this site, I'll look in and I'll look at, what parts of the land might be used, how big of that area might be. And I want to dig into a little bit more information on that space. But now we've moved in a little bit closer. Now we're maybe at, a few thousand feet off or whatever. Actually, we're probably still about 10,000, but before we're at 100,000. But anywho, you can use, there's some tools in here, there are measuring tools to size out specific fields, which I think is kind of neat if you want to know kind of what area you're dealing with, making some plans. You can measure in distance or in area, and you can change your units as well. So in this case, you drag, there's just click tools to kind of click along the edge, and then you double click it to finish it, and then it'll create a perimeter around the area you want to measure. And in this case, that's a just under 40-acre piece of land. So if you're looking at, okay, well, I'm looking at, looking at a quarter, how much of that land is arable and is farmed or has been previously farmed. Okay, so that's the wide scale, the 100,000 to 10,000 square foot level, or foot level anyways, not square foot. But now we want to start gathering information at a regional level. Now we want to start getting the type of information that we need that can give us a sense of what's being done in that area, would give us some more clues. So we might talk to I'll certainly talk to the county and say, okay, what else has been grown in this thing here? Like, what's the cropping history? Does anybody know? Can you get that from the realtor, from the previous owner, or whatever? Do you have that if you own the land? What's the cropping history like? And I should say that all of the tools that I mentioned are things you could use to get a bit more historic background, or sort of majorly historic background on the land that you already have. Back to field history though. So cropping history, what's been grown there, say in the last number of years? Has it always been, has it always been pasture, or is it, has it been cropped, canola snow rotations, straight canola for 20 years? What kind of pesticide use has there been in the crop and on the adjacent areas? And especially important in terms of herbicides. Horticulture crops are very sensitive to herbicide residue. And so if there's been use around, it may have some significant impacts on the types of crops that you might be able to grow. We want to know what kind of fertilizer or manure applications have been made. If you can get that, that's great information. It might affect some of your crop management information. And it might also answer some of the questions as you gather more data. And then theoretically, what kind of crop rotations have been in place? Are they, again, is it a canola snow rotation? Has it been, straight canola basically with a break for winter? Or has it been, regularly cropped into other things? You can expect some reasonably good soil profile penetration with different crops. I like to say you need to know that field history for yourself if you're new, and if you're existing, you should keep track of that. Keep the record keeping, because you're not going to remember necessarily, but if you run into an issue, sometimes your history will be able to solve that by saying, oh yeah, I did this. That's sort of the now I'm seeing the results, or that kind of thing. You need to be, if you take a sort of a right turn at some point down the road, knowing what you did down the road or in the past might help you sort of navigate some of the new fun that you're experiencing with new crops. Okay, when you get to the individual field level, this is the point where we gather the data. Now say you've got land, bought land, you're planning to either start growing, or you're just wanting to get a bit more detailed information. This is the point where we want to know things about the texture and the quality. We want to test the soil of the specific field so that we know what we're dealing with within the growing profile of the soil. So this is soil testing. And I mean, you can hire people to do that, absolutely. But ultimately what we want to do is get an understanding of the specific soil quality characteristics. We want to know what makes that soil tick. We want to establish a baseline in terms of fertility and sort of baseline in terms of quality. And that affects our management going forward. But we also want to know, is there some major flags, some major issues that are going to prevent it from being useful? Is it going to prevent it from being a suitable site for us to grow things on? So when you're starting up or before that, You want to gather the information, and then as you're going through growing, then you're going to want to testing regularly. I prefer, soil testing is, you can be doing it at any time, but generally we do it in the fall when temperatures get down below 5, so the soil's not warm, but it's cooled off a bit, but it's not frozen. Or we do it in the spring prior to seeding. Again, hopefully it's not frozen, so we can, it's not so hard to get samples out. For a startup, I recommend that you take samples at more than one depth. So get a soil profile for the top foot, and then get one for the next foot down the next profile. First time, one time only. If you're going for a longer, like a more perennial crop, something like an orchard or something, the deeper profile is going to be important because that's going to be your deep reserve. And so it's good to know what's down there, right? Later on, as you're sampling, you can keep in that top 6 inches to a foot, depending on the crop. But for startup, take 2 samples. Yeah, it's a little bit more money to start off, but it's not a lot. Get those soil samples done and find it out. You sample from across the field, then you bulk those samples. I'll show you a sort of a process picture for that. And you're ultimately going to avoid anything weird, any weird spots on the field that will throw off the average. You want to get rid of those, because otherwise you're just going to get data that means nothing. So here's what it would look like. So on a field, we would avoid anywhere with the red X's because they're going to throw off the data. So we'll take samples, and you don't have to take like 100 million samples. I mean, you really don't. It just depends on how confident you want to be in that data. In this case, I just kind of goofed around and said, okay, well, we're going to take, these many samples. But you collect the samples from across the field, mix the samples together, bulk them, homogenize them to make them kind of uniform. And then you take the sample from that, send the sample to the lab for testing. It's as simple as that. If you collect data from weird spots, you're just going to throw the average up. Okay. The other key thing is to make sure the appropriate testing is done. So find out what's included in the test. You don't need a greenhouse test. You don't need stuff for heavy metals unless that's a concern, and then I would suggest a separate test. But ultimately, you really just need to know what are the available macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. What's the organic matter content of that soil, pH, which is the acidity or alkalinity of the soil? What's the electrical conductivity or the salinity of that soil? And I always recommend at the start, get a texture test. It's an add-on, but for the first time, texture's not going to change. But knowing what the texture is like is going to mean a huge amount of, it's a huge amount of information because it has a major impact on how water and other nutrients and things move in the soil. So get the texture add-on for sure. But the point is, a basic test is going to cost you about $45, and then another $20 for a texture test. I mean, that's pretty consistent across from most labs that I've dealt with. Get testing done in the area where you live, because their testing is typically geared to the soils that you have. Sending it across Canada to somewhere else. If you're in Alberta and you send it to Ontario, they're lovely people, but they have different soils, and some of the things that apply there don't apply here. So get them tested here. It's just easier. Plus, it doesn't cost much for shipping. So when you get a test back, this is what a soil test looks like in general terms. And these are ones that I've just had some done last year, a couple of years ago, and this is the basic information. So here's the depth of your sample. And it could be, you could have multiple samples with the numbers different. These are your macronutrients, so your nitrate, nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, and your sulfate, sulfur. And then these pictures here from this lab, they provide this. I mean, these just give me a quick visual on how big the numbers are compared to each other. These deficient, low, optimum, excess really don't apply. They may not apply to the crops that you're interested in growing. They're more sort of just general guidelines. If they get below a certain number, they kind of trigger where they're going to be. So don't worry about that, worry about the numbers, and let somebody help you figure out what it means in terms of the crop you want to grow. Again, your sample depth here, your percent organic matters here, which affects the estimated nitrogen release in pounds per acre. So the higher the organic matter, the potential nitrogen release is higher. This is your pH. So this soil here is fairly alkaline. This is your soluble salts or your electrical conductivity. And we want to be below 1 as a general rule. Lower the better. And then if you got the texture test that I recommended, this is going to tell you the texture class of it. So this is a sandy clay loam, and the sort of distribution of sand, silt, and clay particles, which are relate to the different sizes. So clay being the smallest, silt being the medium, and sand being the biggest particles. So that's essentially what it looks like. You could get micronutrients here. The numbers come in pounds per acre, or in the case of micronutrients in parts per million, which there's a way to convert those, but they're just needed in very small amounts. And these are just some explanations here again of these different variables, but the idea between the organic matter and the estimated end release is just represents a sort of an organic matter storage of potentially releasing how much of that nitrogen is going to come out of that organic matter slowly and surely. Okay, now let's take it through the climatic information, which you've said, okay, I got the site, I got some information on soil, but is the site where I want to grow something, can I grow it in my area? So how do you get a sense of what will the climate in your area support the crop that you want to grow? So this is another Government of Alberta database, and it's like there's tons of stuff in it, and we're blessed in Alberta. We got a whole lot of weather stations and things to work on, but this site provides maps and weather station data, forecast, radar, maps and tools, current and historic data. And that's what I want to look at, is the historic data. So this is what Alberta Climate Information Service page looks like. There's a range of different tools, as I mentioned. Current weather conditions, weather station data, weather condition maps, radar imagery, forecasts, climate and atlas maps. So this is sort of like more historic trends and big maps if you want to watch that it's getting wetter or drier. They're alarming because they're very colorful, but lots of different things you can pull from, both current and from the past. Climate normals, wind directions, historic weather data, lots of information, things like this. And I'm going to touch on historic weather data, and I'm going to touch on the weather station data as well. Okay, and then at the bottom, if you're an irrigator, like you can look at, there's lots of other tools that'll allow you to sort of fine tune your irrigation. They're more geared to the southern part of the province that are in the irrigation districts, but still good tools. So let's look at weather station data. So there are hundreds of weather stations. Not all of them have the same data. These are initially you'll see a popular. So these are the types of data that most people are going to want to see. Observed means this is what was observed on the date or time that you were collecting it for, and normals represent sort of interpolated data that's been kind of gathered as sort of averages or norms for that area. You can change your data periods from daily to weekly to monthly to yearly. You can change your precipitation units if you want to, and you can also change the date range. Some of the things you're looking for sometimes may restrict you on how close you can get to where you are. I usually like to pick, if I'm looking for an area, I usually like to pick a full year or so, or a growing season from, say, like April 1 to October 31st or something like that, and just pick a date range that seems to make sense. It's going to cover the gamut of my time that I want to know, and then pick it in the past so you get a full data set. Don't go too far back, but go within the last couple of years and gather that. Let me just take you on a tour through this here. So when you zoom in using the plus or minus or control with a scroll bar, you can zoom in. And again, we're going to focus on this little station right here. So as you get in close, all of the stations that are available are yellow, and none of these boxes have been clicked. If you click a station, you'll find out which of the variables are available for you to actually gather data from. If you go, you can choose popular elements, which are the kind of, precipitation, temperature, wind speed, some of these other calculated things. But you can look at elements, ones that are, very specific, solar radiation at 2 meters or relative humidity at 2 meters, or some of these other ones that might be available. But if they're available for that site, they're going to be highlighted in green. you can look at derivatives, which are calculated ones. So growing degree days, which are based on our calculation based on min-max and base temperature for growing a certain crop. Corn heat units, the same kind of thing. You know, sort of stuff like that. You can also get normals, which again are interpolated data, which is sort of calculated. This is expected data for that particular place. So what's the normal estimated total solar radiation in megajoules per meter squared, if you want to know that. Maybe you want to be like that kind of thing. Or you can look at the almanac, which is more historic. What is it normally like for min-max and that kind of thing in June? You know, when are the frost-free days at, you know, when can I expect frost-free period to be? You know, this is all historical data, but hugely useful once in a while. One thing to note is that Almanac only works for yearly data. You can't pull like daily, that kind of thing. So when you select a site, right? So you have to change. You may have to change your period that you're allowed to select. Okay, so in the case of here, like when you select, I chose yearly, and now I have all sorts of choices for Busby that I can choose all these different historical type almanac data. As I mentioned, if you select the data element, the element that you're interested in, and you're interested in an area, the weather stations that are available for you to get data from are still in green, and then any of the ones that aren't available are not. They'll be redded out and faded out, and not, you can't click on them. So that's a good way to kind of weed out. So you can go one way or the other. You can click on the station and find out what's available, or you can click on the thing that you're interested in and find the station in the area that might give you the data that you want. I like using growing degree days as a derivative because you can assess growing season suitability. If you want to grow some warmer stuff, you know, or things that won't grow below 10 or grow below 5 or whatever, you know, pick a growing degree day and then look and see if that kind of what the norms are for that area. So when you're choosing your stuff, okay, so I've chosen, I want to know the temperature normal is. I want to know what the wind speed at 2 meters is. So what's our general wind speed, and what's the growing degree days at 5 degrees as a 5-degree base temperature. I chose monthly, I want millimeters, and I've chosen my date to go from January 1 of 2021 to January 1 of 2022. So I want a full year. Unclick the flags because that just adds more columns to your data that you don't need. And then you can click to different outputs. You can put it into a graph or a table or just look at it. I like to put it into comma separated value, like basically an Excel file, and then I can mess with the data and make my own charts and stuff. But this is basically what it would look like. So I chose those sort of the normals. And so here's my wind speed, here's my the monthly that I collected, here's my average air temperature, and in long term, and here's my growing degree days. And this is sort of an accumulated thing. So it gives me some information from that particular, from the Busby Ag Canada meteorology station. One of the other things that the Alberta Climate Information Service place can provide you with is all this almanac and historical maps and data. And so here's precipitation accumulation, or, you know, you can get current and historic agroclimatic maps, which is kind of interesting. And again, very colorful, not super useful in terms of right at the point, but if you can get a sense of what's happening, you'll get a sense of, you know, what are the norms been for that area? Is it typically fairly moist or drier or whatever? And you can choose all these temperature, precipitation, soil, drought, fire, all these other types of things you can work in there. One of the other things that I like is you can go by historic data by township, and you can pull data that's running for years, and you can zoom in and get that. And one of the neat things you can collect is you can get precipitation and this normal data for that particular township, historic data of what's the precipitation like in that area normally, which kind of brings you back out to that 100,000 foot level. What's the light like in that? You see a lot of questions, and they'll say, oh, I want to grow something and I need lots of light, and I heard that this place has lots of it. Well, you know, this might provide you some extra data if that supports what you're trying to do as a business. One of the other things that you're going to run into if you're selecting a site is the freezing date. I mean, we have winter, we have summer, winter, and construction, but freezing date probabilities basically is that hard line of the start and the end of the season, and it's a good indicator of what types of things you can, what can you expect. It's pretty predictable, and it's useful. And the nice thing is it doesn't change. It's based on historic data, right? So this is an oldie but a goodie. And rather than looking at this thing and saying, wow, that's a really old fact sheet, Rob, what I look at it is I said, that's an experienced fact sheet. It's been right for a long time. And the idea between the freezing date predictor here is that 50% probability, like it's pretty predictable for a bunch of different sites. It'll tell you what your growing season length is, more than half the time it's right. And if you want to, you can go either way a little bit and get some adjustment. But it is an interesting thing to look at. And it's important to look at it because if you suddenly forget that you live somewhere where the season is short, it can be like this is like a cold bucket of water to sort of bring you back into reality a little bit. Alberta Climate Information Service also has those estimated probable freezing dates, and it's actually a really cool tool. You can go through the current historic weather station data, you choose the normals, choose the frost probability for whatever, when is it typically beyond, above freezing or down to -5 frost, when does that period normally look like? Choose the station, choose the date range, and then graph it. And this is what it looks like. So for the site that I chose, generally, there's still a 92% chance of frost for a 0 degree for frost at Busby as late as the 5th of May. And it really starts, the last chance you're going to be like, well, there's almost no chance of frost by about the 14th of June. So that's kind of disheartening. And by the middle of August, we're back to the chance of it. But it does give you sort of a good sense of what the range of your season is. Okay, so that's climate. Let's talk about water quickly here. We use water a lot. Horticulture crops are made up of, mostly water. Vegetables and fruit for sure. Some of the other ones may be a little less soggy, but we need water. I mean, you can grow all of those crops without water. You can grow them better with water. And so we need good quality water for irrigation. We need water for washing. It doesn't have to be as good as irrigation water. It has to be clean though, so it has to be potable water. We also, depending on, for at least its last wash stage, we need water for post-harvest cooling. We also use water for some crops to frost protect, and sometimes we use it to cool a crop off so it doesn't overheat and it can still continue to grow. First thing to consider with water is the quality. Is the water good enough for the use that I want it for? Right? I mean, you can just say, well, I got some great water. Yeah. Well, maybe it's not good enough for what you want to do with it. Okay. Second consideration is, can I use it legally? And I'll dig into that a little bit deeper. Just because you have water on your property does not mean you can use it. Just because you can see it doesn't mean you have legal access to it. Third consideration is quantity. How much do I need to do what I need to do? Do I have enough good quality water to do what I need to do? And do I have enough to do that every year and for all the crop that I want to grow? Okay, so let's look at the first part. So legal access, this is Alberta specific. It may vary in other regions, just FYI. But in a general sense, just keep the idea in mind. If you take nothing else away and you're from somewhere else or whatever, just say, okay, I need to look into what's my rights to water in terms of what can I do with water? Because this isn't one of those beg forgiveness kind of things. This is more of the, just do it right from the get-go. Don't go into the beg forgiveness realm of the world. Okay, so with water sources, we have a bunch of different ones. Okay, so we have natural water bodies, which are rivers and streams and lakes and ponds, sloughs and things like that, right? So those are natural water bodies. In Alberta, we have irrigation canals. They have different rules. If you're in an irrigation district, it's something different, just move on. Dugouts are another water source. They can be naturally filled through rain, snow, or runoff, or they can be pump filled. Different rules apply, but ultimately they represent a water source. And a lot of places in Alberta use dugouts as a water source. So rules are there. Then we have wells, just generally say don't use wells. But I mean, they can represent a water source for certain uses, just not irrigation. Okay, so we're in the irrigation districts in Southern Alberta. There are licensing that relates to that. You're in those areas, you can work with the irrigation district to sort that out. There are rules, it's all very clear. If you're in that area, you probably already know about it, so that's fine. If you're not, you're looking at private, and that's where we're going now. Okay, so a water license represents a temporary diversion. Just think of it like a ladder. The water rights, kind of whoever got onto the ladder first gets first dibs. Okay, just because you own land does not mean you can access the water sources that are on it. Just because you can see it does not mean you can pump from it. A license required for anything other than a pond or dugout that's filled completely naturally, rain, snow, or dugout. If you're filling it by pumping, there's a license going to be required for it. It may be a little different, but it's still required. If you've got a river runs through it, does not mean that you can use it for irrigation. Okay, so there's rules that go with that. There's a process to get a private water license or a temporary diversion. First, you have to do a land classification study, which evaluates it for suitability of irrigation. Is the land going to be negatively affected by irrigation? Yes or no? It's more complicated than that, but that's there. The Ag Feasibility Report is the next stage, which evaluates the irrigation activity itself, what its impact is going to be on the land. Okay, so first, is the land okay? Then is, if we irrigate it, is the irrigation going to affect the land? Then there's, are we going to hurt any fish or wildlife or anything else at all, or any natural sort of impacts? That's the next step. And then Alberta Environment ultimately issues the license. This is not a short-term process. The best thing is if the land already has a water license on it, that comes with it. Great. If you have to go through the process, you're looking at some expense and some time. But it is what it is. And then there are rules and reporting and things that go with a water license, where you have to report to Alberta Environment. I guess my short way of getting through this is to say, there are people that can help work through this. There are water specialists with Alberta Ag that still exist and that can help you work through this. And I would recommend having a chat with them. So general rules of thumb for water. Potable is necessary for all final washes. So you need to have good quality potable water for if you're going to be doing any washing of produce. Potable does not mean it's irrigation quality. You could use water that is potable that is not good enough to irrigate with. You could use theoretically irrigation water for potable for washing as well. It just depends. As a general rule, you're going to need around 12 inches of water per season. So 12 inches in terms of 12 acre inches or whatever. You might need as much as 14 to 20 waterings, as 14 to 20 inches a year. So an inch a week is a general rule about that. And so that represents about 2,000 cubic meters or 70,000 cubic feet. So you need a lot of water. That's the point. It's not as simple as, oh, I got this little dugout, I'm good to go. It may not be enough to carry you over the volume that you need for the time that you need. Just a couple of more slides just to talk about other tools for business planning or assessing. So you've got a site, you got a solid idea. Are there any other tools or other information you might gather? The answer is yes. I like statistical data. I mean, I'm no statistician. I have a personality, but but it is interesting to gather information. If you're looking at a site and you're looking at an idea, are there data that you can get to support the idea you have? Can you pull census data, which can help set prices because a certain population density or certain population demographic can support a certain price point? is there ethnocultural data that you can use that will allow you to access a new part of the market or a new market, a new crop? You know, what about price comparisons on land? Is there other type of data that you can pull? There are statistical data that'll help build your business plan. You know, what can you expect in terms of what's your competition like? Who else is out there? What type of yield can you expect? What type of other, you know, what the average price is at wholesale? You know, things like that that type of statistical data is really useful in terms of capturing data to support your idea. But the idea overall this was to sort of say, okay, first I want to build my idea, what I need to fit inside of it, and then I need to look at, you know, what kind of information I've got. Okay, so that's where I'll leave it at that. My contact information is here on my website. There is also more specific contact information if you want to get a hold of me.
Talking about growing degree days, and I think it's great that we can find that information. To me, that would be a prime indicator of a piece of land for growing horticultural crops. Is there a chart that gives you a bit of an idea of how many growing degree days are required if you wanted to grow sweet corn versus if you want to be growing root crops? It's all well and good to have that number, but you kind of need to have a reference point to know whether it's good or bad.
That's a good question. I don't know that there's probably charts there. I mean, for things when you're looking at different corn varieties, they may have corn heat unit things attached to them. Corn heat units are similar to growing degrees, and the base temperature for corn being 10 degrees Celsius. The idea is you can just compare one site to another. I mean, if you're, you know, it accumulates, right? So it's min temp or max minus min divided by the base, or something like that. I can't remember the formula exactly, but it's math. But the idea is that, you know, it accumulates, or each day you get it. So you might pick up, you know, 2 or 3 in one day because it didn't get much. And then, you know, as it builds and builds, so the higher the number, the better, I guess. I don't have a table that says, you know, this is how many heat units growing degree days you need specifically for this crop, but it'll give you a pretty good sense if you've selected a high one and you're, you know, like a 10-degree base, which you're going to need for corn and beans and other things. And, you know, you're in the, you know, you're pretty low, you know, in the low, you know, several hundred kind of thing, then you might look at it and go, well, that might be a little risky. I'd look right along with some of the other sort of more temperature normals too, and sort of get a sense of, you know, at what point am I starting to accumulate any type of growing degrees? If I'm not accumulating any growing degree days until, you know, July, then, you know, good chance it's going to stop accumulating and topping out in some time in August, and you're going to know that your season's just going to be a bit too short. So, but I suspect there are tables out there that go with that, but I don't have one off the top of my head.
Thanks, Rob. And Sheila mentioned that if people have more questions about soil sampling and stuff, there many of the ag services departments in your municipalities can help you out with the technical aspects of that. Any soils information or further explain growing degree days, just contact them. While we're waiting for more questions, I was just compiling a few links of funding potential funding if you're looking for assistance in setting up your business. So I'm just going to copy and paste this in the chat. You can take a look at it when you've got some time. There's a question, how much land should I start with? Do you have kind of a A general rule of thumb for somebody starting out, you know, like if you're really if you're not familiar, you know, start small, or what would be your recommendation?
Generally, I would say start small, but it really depends on what crop it is. Like some crops, you know, if you've got an idea for a certain type of crop and you've got to like take it to, okay, how do I want to market it? Like if you want to market, you want to grow something and you want to market it locally with UPIC or at a local farmer's market, you can probably get away with, quarter acre, half an acre, 1 acre, depends on what it is. As you get into stuff, depends on the yield and what expectations there are. So, Saskatoon berries are probably going to start with a bit bigger, and you might go, somewhere between 2 and 5 or 10 acres. If you've elaborate on that and say, okay, well, I want to do it mechanically, maybe you're going to look at, 10, 20, 40 kind of things, or stage it. So you're going to plan to grow it, like to build it and increase it over time. If you're looking at vegetables and a bunch of mixed crops, you might start small until you figure out what you're doing so that the risk isn't there. Like, if you say, okay, I'm going to grow vegetables and I'm jumping in at 50 acres. Well, there are farms that have been growing for 35, 40 years that aren't at 50 yet. And they're great growers and they've been doing it forever. And so maybe start small. So, if you're going to start with vegetables, maybe you're going to start with, half an acre to an acre, something like that, or even less. Get a feel for it. If you're pretty comfortable with your soil in your area and you're pretty comfortable with the crop that you're wanting to grow, okay, then maybe you can go up a little bit bigger. But I would say generally start small, figure out what you're doing, make your mistakes at the small level, but then have the plan to grow. Like if you don't plan to be, okay, I'm only ever going to be, a quarter acre, unless that's what you want to do. Fine, good, cool. But if you want to be bigger, like have that plan in the back of your mind so that you have so that it's now an add-on or a build. It's not just I have to recreate everything every time I want to start and go bigger or whatever. But generally the recommendation is to start small. If you're going to, grow vegetables, generally start at a direct market level so you can kind of learn and figure things out before you get into like commercial contracts or where you're trying to hit, federal grade targets or standards and where you have to do like Canada Gap and, meet, all these standards. Start smaller and get things figured out, because there's going to be enough of stuff coming at you to start with that. And in fruit, things like strawberries, a lot of people will start with 3,000 plants, which sounds like a lot, but that's like a quarter acre or not even. It's a small, like that's 1 unit of strawberries that you order in terms of crowns. So start with that maybe, or even get 1,000, split it with somebody, right? Or just get things figured out. Work the kinks out small, but then start to build. And as you get bigger, you're going to have to kind of figure out your equipment and figure out your labor and other things. But small scale, you can kind of get started and you can kind of handle it with a couple of people yourself or whatever.
Are there producer groups or ways to meet other growers to kind of to learn from?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's what I like about horticulture. Most of the industry is super helpful. Alberta Farm Fresh Producers Association has always been great. They put on workshops and things, and they're doing tours and webinars. And I don't know, I think they might have had either they're building the concept or they're doing it is a mentorship program. But even so, find a producer that's maybe not in your area, but that's going to do something that you're interested in or you're looking at doing. You're not direct competition. Sit down, have a chat with them, go for a visit. But yeah, there are good supports that way. Yeah, there are trade shows, conferences, things like that. Anytime you get a chance to network and build, talk to people, that's a great way to do it. But it's one thing that I love about this industry is that they're always pretty open. They're not going to share everything, and not everybody's going to share, but the majority of them have been there and were helped along just the same as you will, and are willing to sort of talk it through to a certain point. And if you ask them to kind of open up their books and everything and just skip the the 5 years of research that they did to get to where they are, or the 10 years, that might not be reasonable to expect, but you can certainly expect them to provide you the get the started thing. And if you're looking to have them light your fire, yeah, they'll certainly do that
Great,
without any issues.
thanks. Here's a question. Can you use amendments to change or address soil pH for larger pieces of land to suit the crop?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is it's complicated. So yes, you can change soil pH. It's just it's a slow process. So I mean, if you're trying to change it, if you're trying to swing the pendulum from alkaline to very acidic, no. But if you want to swing it a little bit and bring in a little more neutral from, say it's 7.5 and you want to take it to low 7s to more closer to neutral, or if you want to just swing it a little bit more acidic from neutral, yes, you can certainly do that through acidifying fertilizers. There's amendments. You can also swing it back the other way. There are different types of amendments for sure. But changing soil pH in a mineral soil is extremely slow, and it takes a lot of product to make very small changes because the soil is such a strong buffer. So
Yeah.
so that's why, yes, it is possible, not always practical.
Okay.
But pH isn't as huge an issue unless it's really far out on the spectrum. Some of the other factors are more manageable and also more impactful. pH tends to affect sort of the micronutrients and things like that. In the most time, it's, you can work with that and just, you can feed the crop with what it needs and get around some of those types of things. But it's good to know so that you know what types of things will be coming at you, but it's not having a pH of one thing isn't a deal breaker that you have to be like, oh, I have to change it to this. No, it's not that huge.
Right. Well, I see we're at 8:30 already, and I think we're going to wrap up the Q&A time right now.
And so I would just like to finish off by saying, Rob, thank you very much for your time, for a very informative session. There are many things to talk about, and you are helping us very carefully walk through that step by step so that we're starting at the beginning and have arrived at where we need to be when it's time to be beginning to plant our crops. So thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. And we'll talk to you again. Bye-bye.